welcome to today's training on navigating the refugee process. My name is Joshua Eisen, and I am the in-house lawyer at FCJ Refugee Center in Toronto. So today we're going to be going over sort of the basics of the refugee process, how it works, the different sort of ways in which you can be processed. And then we'll talk a little bit about the hearing, preparing for the hearing, and then sort of what to do after the hearing if you are or are not successful. So it's going to be a sort of general overview of all that stuff. I'll ask that people keep questions to the end of the presentation. So I'll provide all the information first. And then if you have questions you want to ask me, please feel free to ask at the end. And I believe we are going to be sharing a PDF version of the PowerPoint presentation. So you can have those slides to refer to down the road. And I think we're also going to be posting it on our website. So there's, various links and things, no worries about, taking photos of everything. You can access it later on. So yeah, let's get started. Okay, so I'll just begin with a quick land acknowledgement. So the land we are standing on today, assuming that you're in Toronto like I am, is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. I'd also like to, before we begin, just make the following disclaimer, which is that this presentation, although I'm a lawyer, this presentation does not contain legal advice, and it shouldn't be interpreted as such. It just provides information that is sort of generally available to the public, and we're just sort of synthesizing that and offering some general guidance on things. So this is not a legal advice. So briefly about us, we're FCJ Refugee Center. We serve refugees and other individuals and families who are at risk due to their immigration status. So basically precarious migrants in general. We're happy to provide any support related to any issues related to a refugee claim or immigration process. And we try to help people navigate, what can often be a confusing and sometimes hostile legal system here in Canada. So we're happy to try and provide our support in any of these issues. And you can see here, there's a bit of a breakdown of the different kinds of programs and supports we offer. We do settlement and integration work, immigration support, including support for refugee claims, pre-removal risk assessments, appeals, humanitarian and compassionate grounds applications, etc. We also do some work with anti-human trafficking and as well as public education and outreach. So before I get into the sort of main part of the presentation, I just want to go over some acronyms and discuss some of the different agencies that are involved in the refugee process. So, you're going to encounter a lot of acronyms in this context. That's pretty normal. One of the main ones is Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada. This is essentially the Immigration Ministry, IRCC. Another one is CBSA, Canadian Border Services Agency. They're responsible for border security, and they also handle removals and deportations, as well as some parts of the refugee claim process. And then there's the IRB, the Immigration and Refugee Board. And they're the people who hear refugee claims, specifically the Refugee Protection Division, the RPD, and then the RAD, the RAD, is the Refugee Appeal Division. So they're the people who you would appeal to if your original or initial refugee claim was not successful. And then there are some other useful acronyms here. A couple to remember are the BOC or BOC, which stands for the Basis of Claim, which is sort of an important document that you're going to need to submit as part of your refugee claim. We'll talk a bit more about that. And the NDP, or National Documentation Package, which is a kind of package of evidence that the board is going to have about your the conditions in your country when you make your refugee claim. So we'll talk a bit more about that down the line. So, okay, my first piece of advice, and maybe I'm a bit biased because I'm a lawyer, but I think that this is generally very sound advice, is that if you want to make a refugee claim in Canada, get a lawyer. It's highly advisable. It's a complicated process. Not everything is immediately apparent. If you don't have sort of specialized knowledge, it's very easy to make mistakes and to get confused about things. So highly recommend that you get a lawyer or other legal representative. Before paying for a lawyer out of your own pocket, if you do have the money, I mean, even if you do have some money, we highly recommend that you contact legal aid and see if you qualify for coverage. Many refugee claimants are going to qualify, so it's definitely worth getting in touch with legal aid to see. Legal aid is basically a government program that helps low-income families, people who can't afford a lawyer, to get legal representation and advice. If you qualify for legal aid, you'll get a lawyer to represent you basically for free. And just so you know, Legal Aid Ontario, so legal aid is kind of broken down by province. So each province has a different legal aid system and they all work a little bit differently. Here in Ontario, we have Legal Aid Ontario, and they provide, and I think this is common for other provinces too, but they provide sort of task-specific certificates. So you can apply to legal aid for a certificate that will pay a lawyer to perform a specific task for you, like preparing the basic documents for the refugee claim. And then you might have to apply again to get a certificate to represent you at your hearing. So, you know, there's sort of different levels or different certificates that are required depending on the task that's involved. So it's just important to keep that in mind. And in terms of how to apply for legal aid, we have some information here. There's a toll-free number you can call. There's also a Toronto-only number, a 416 number. They're both listed here. And I highly recommend that you call early in the morning to avoid waiting time. When you apply, you'll speak to two different people generally. They're going to ask you questions about your financial situation, and also about, you know, the kind of support you need. And if you qualify, you'll be given what's called a certificate number or CE number, which then you'll share with a lawyer down the road. And if you need assistance with any of this, you can come to an organization like FCJ if you're in the Greater Toronto area, and we can help you to apply for legal aid and get a legal aid certificate. We're happy to do that because the process can be a little bit confusing sometimes. Um, Before I sort of get into more detail on how the different claims process works, I think it's just important to kind of break down what are the basic components of a refugee claim. So a refugee claim has, I guess, three main components. So the first is the basis of claim form, which I mentioned, and this is a form that you can download from the internet. You probably will receive a copy if you make a claim at a port of entry, which I'll get into what that means later. But basically, it's a form where you include sort of basic information about yourself, about family members, about your you know, birth date, where you're from, etc. And then there's also a number of sort of spaces that are provided where you're supposed to answer different questions about why you're claiming refugee protection. You know, why are you at risk in your country of origin? You know, did you go to the police? Were they able to protect you, et cetera, et cetera. The normal practice that we follow now is instead of filling out all of those questions on the form, we just say, see attached narrative, and then we write a separate sort of single narrative story explaining all of these things, sort of going into detail about why you're claiming refugee protection, et cetera. So we have the basis of claim, that's just the form, and then we have the narrative, which is the story explaining why you're in danger, why you're seeking refugee protection, why the state or the police in your country can't protect you, etc. I highly recommend that you get some sort of legal advice to help you when you're filling out these forms, especially the narrative, because it's going to be very important later on. It sort of forms the basis of all of the questions that they're going to ask you in your hearing and ultimately plays a big part in the decision they make about whether or not to grant your claim. So it's really important that you get legal advice before you fill that out. And then the final component is either the IRCC portal, that's sort of the more common thing nowadays, or the paper forms, the generic, the Schedule 12 and the Schedule A. That's a little bit less common these days. But basically, this is just, well, the portal, it's an online portal where you put in a bunch of information about yourself, your family info, your work history, your education, all kinds of questions. It's pretty straightforward. But again, I highly recommend asking a lawyer for help filling it out if you can get a legal aid certificate or if you have somebody you're working with. And one important thing to remember when you're filling out the portal is, so refugee claimants, I should mention, will automatically qualify for work permits. And the work permit, they don't have to pay a fee, which normally you do have to do. So if you want to get a work permit, it's very important when you're filling out the portal that you indicate, so there's going to be a page that asks you if you want to get a work permit. There's a box you can tick. You just tick yes. It's very easy. And then once the portal is submitted, you should get a work permit. It might take a few months to get, but there's nothing else you have to do. So just very important to keep that in mind. And if for any reason you want to fill out paper forms instead of a portal, that is possible. You can contact the email address that we have listed here and explain the situation, and they will make accommodations for you. But generally, I recommend if you have access to a phone or a computer, filling out the portal is better because I think it speeds the process up a little bit. And in terms of resources on how to fill out the basis of claim, again, I highly recommend getting legal advice before you fill out the basis of claim form in the narrative. But you can find out more about this, and we have instructions in different languages, including Spanish, Portuguese, Amharic, Slovakian, and Czech on our website. And there's a link here in the slideshow, as you can see. So now I'll talk a bit about the different sorts of ways in which a refugee claim can be processed, depending on how the claim is initiated. So there's a few different ways in which you can make a refugee claim in Canada. Um, One of them is what's called an inland claim. So that's the first thing I'm going to talk about. So an inland claim is made by somebody who is already in Canada. So say you travel to Canada on a tourist visa, you have a study permit, something like that. You're already inside the country with that other status, as a tourist or visitor or whatever. And then you want to make a refugee claim once you're already inside the country. Then in that context, you're making what's called an inland claim. This would also be the case if you entered Canada illegally, quote unquote, or between official ports of entry. And in that case, I highly recommend speaking to a lawyer before you initiate your claim. But you would also be making an inland claim in that context. Sorry, I'm just, there's some issue with the waiting room here. Okay. Okay, all right, we're good. So a few things are important to remember about inland claims. So for an inland claim, the claim has not been initiated until you fill out your portal and you attach the various documents that you need to submit alongside it. So to fill out your portal, you go to this IRCC website, you open up an account, you should speak with a lawyer or legal representative and they can help you with this. Or if you don't have access to that, come to an organization like FCJ and we're happy to help you. We have intake days on Mondays, just FYI. But yeah, you initiate your claim and you sort of fill out the portal, upload documents, and then it's only after you submit all of that that your claim is actually initiated. So just important to keep that in mind. And for inland claims as well, the portal needs to be accompanied by the basis of claim and narrative form, a scan of your passport, as well as a signed use of representative form if you're working with a lawyer. So all those documents need to be uploaded and submitted alongside the portal. One thing to remember for inland claims is that there's no deadline. So basically, until you submit the claim, the government doesn't know that you want to make a refugee claim. So there's no deadline for submitting anything. But there are a couple of things that I should mention. One is that you should try to submit the claim as soon as possible after you arrive in the country because excessive delays can cause problems for the claim later on and raise some issues that I'll get into later. And in addition, once you've initiated an account on the portal and begun a claim, you have 90 days to complete the claim before it is automatically deleted. They do that for privacy reasons. And if it's automatically deleted, there's no real consequence. You can just start again, but it is obviously extra work and can make your life more difficult than it needs to be. So it's good to just try and get that in as quickly as possible. And just keep in mind that there is that 90-day deadline. Okay, so once you've submitted all of the components of the claim, so you've filled out your portal, you've uploaded your basis of claim document, you've uploaded your narrative, you've scanned your passport and uploaded that, and then if you're working with a lawyer, you have a signed use of rep that you've also uploaded. Then you just hit submit, you have to sign something virtually, and everything is submitted. And then basically what you do is you'll wait, and usually within a week or so, the government is going to send you 2 documents to your portal. These documents are both very important. So the first is the acknowledgement of claim document, or the acknowledgement letter. We'll talk about that in a second. And then the second is the instructions for the medical exam, and we'll talk about that as well. So the acknowledgement of claim document. So there's an image of it up here. This is basically what it looks like. And this document is like your temporary proof of status as a refugee claimant. It's kind of like a temporary refugee ID. Um, and it confirms that you've initiated a refugee claim, basically. And so this document's really important because, first of all, it allows you to get coverage for medical care through the interim. That allows you to access medical services free of charge. I think there's pharmacare under it as well, so you can access drugs and things like that. And it's, yeah, generally very important to get that coverage as soon as possible, just in case there are any medical issues that arise. And then depending on the province, it also might be able to allow you to access different kinds of benefits, including social assistance. It can help you enroll children in school and things like that. So in Ontario, for instance, the acknowledgement of claim letter is really important because it allows you to get Ontario Works, which is basically a form of financial assistance from the government. They give you a payment every month. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's definitely better than nothing. So important to keep that in mind. So this acknowledgement of claim document is very important for those reasons. And just to talk a little bit more about the interim federal healthcare program, which I just mentioned. So often it's difficult to find people, even after you have coverage, not all doctors will accept IFHP because it can be difficult for them to get reimbursed from the government. So if you're having trouble finding a doctor, even after you have interim federal healthcare protection through the program, you can come to an organization like FCJ and we can help you to find somebody to take care of you. It's also important that it's very, very difficult to get fees reimbursed if you pay for anything out of pocket, even if you are covered by IFHP. So if a doctor asks you to pay some money and tells you can get reimbursed later, definitely think twice before you do that. And I would, again, recommend coming to speak to an organization that does. Coverage under IFHP also, it's important to note. So it ends if you have a negative decision on your claim, or if you have a positive decision, in which case you would be transitioned to another kind of healthcare. If you have a negative decision, you lose coverage unless you appeal. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that whole process later, but it's just something important to keep in mind. The next thing, or the other document that you'll receive a few days after submitting your inland claim is what's called the medical exam form. So the medical exam form is basically just a form saying you have to do a medical exam within 30 days. It's very important that you do it within those 30 days, or else it can seriously delay the process. It's pretty simple. There's instructions on the form that you'll download from your portal that basically just tell you what to do. There's a link to a website where you can find an authorized physician near you who can conduct the exams. The exam should be free of charge as long as you bring your acknowledgement of claim document with you. And yeah, it's all fairly straightforward. But again, if you have any issues with that, it's good to come speak to people at an NGO like FCJ, and we can assist. The other thing that you will eventually get, although this is going to take longer, so the first two documents I mentioned usually arrive within a week or so. The other thing that's going to come eventually is the work permit. People are always very anxious about getting the work permit as soon as possible, but in general, there's usually a delay of at least a couple of months, sometimes more, before you receive it. But as long as you check the proper box when you're submitting your portal, you should get it eventually. It's very important to keep your address up to date with IRCC. And if you have a lawyer, they can help you do that. But I'll also talk about how to do that a little bit later on. But it's very important to keep your address up to date to make sure that the work permit goes to the correct address, because it can really delay things. If you move, you don't update your address, and then they send the work permit to your old address. So very important to keep your address up to date. And yeah, once you have received your work permit, you can take the work permit and the acknowledgement letter or the acknowledgement of claim document to a Service Canada office. There are various Service Canada offices in the GTA, and they're all across Canada. And with those two documents, you can get a social insurance number or a SIN number. And you need a SIN number before you can begin to work legally in Canada. So just something to keep in mind. So, okay, after you've received these documents, you've done your medical exams, you have your acknowledgement of claim document, what do? Basically, you're just going to be waiting around for a while. And in a period of time, it's usually at least a couple of months. It really varies from case to case, I've found, and sort of depending on when the claim was submitted as well. Sometimes the wait is a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more. But after on average a few months, you'll get invited to what's called an eligibility interview. And sometimes this is one interview or one appointment. Sometimes it's two. It's with IRCC, usually at a local IRCC office, depending on where you're located. And during one of these appointments, they'll just take your biometric information. So they're going to also seize your passport. So they'll take your passport, they'll give you a certified copy, they'll take fingerprints and other biometric data. And that's basically it. And then there might be a second appointment or a second interview, or they might be consolidated into a single one, but there's going to be another sort of interview part where you speak with an IRCC officer, basically to confirm that you are not inadmissible to Canada and that you're eligible to continue with the refugee process. There are a few different things that they consider here, but for most people, the only ones that are really relevant are whether you have a record of what's called serious criminality, either in Canada or back home in your home country, and whether you've made a previous refugee claim in either the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, or I should also say Canada. So if you have a previous refugee claim or if you have a record of serious criminality, you're going to be ineligible. And otherwise, you're probably eligible. And what happens if you are eligible is you'll receive the brown paper, which is also known as the Refugee Protection Claimant document. That's like your more sort of permanent refugee ID, but it sort of functions similarly to the acknowledgement of claim document. It can be used to access benefits and things like that. You should receive a paper confirming that your case has been referred to the Immigration and Refugee Board. And yeah, that's basically it. And then you're going to wait around for a hearing to be scheduled. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. If your claim is found ineligible for any reason, so if you have a record of serious criminality, if you made a previous refugee claim, you might be invited to do what's called an enhanced pre-removal risk assessment, or PRA. I'm not going to get into that in too much detail now, but if that is your situation, I highly recommend that you go and speak with a lawyer. Okay. Okay, so that essentially is how an inland claim works. Now I'll talk a little bit about another kind of claim or another way in which you can make a claim and the sort of process that flows from that. And this is what's called a port of entry claim. So what is a port of entry or POE claim? So port of entry claims are made upon arrival at Canada, in Canada, either at a land or sea border or at an airport. They're processed in a number of different ways depending on where you arrive. So I'm going to sort of talk about a few different scenarios, but the rules are generally similar for all of them. And in reality, port of entry claims are usually made by people arriving at an airport. So they've flown to Canada from somewhere else or at Canada's land border with the US. And for people who do make claims at Canada's land border with the US, it's important to know that the Safe Third Country Agreement, which is a treaty agreement between Canada and the United States, applies and it impacts who is able to make a port of entry claim at the Canadian border with the United States. So basically, what the Safe Third Country Agreement says is that if you travel through the USA en route to Canada, you have to make a refugee claim there. So basically, if you're in the US first, you have to make a claim in the United States. And it also applies in reverse. So if you first arrive in Canada, then you have to make a claim in Canada. You can't make a claim in the United States. So that usually prevents people who have made a claim and who have traveled through the US from making a claim in Canada. But there are certain exceptions, and I'll just get into those briefly. So there's an exception for people who have qualifying family members in Canada, and qualifying family members are people like a spouse, a legal guardian, a child, a parent, a sibling, grandparent, and there's a list that we've included here. So it's a fairly generous definition of family, but it doesn't include everyone. And because, definitions of family differ so much from sort of culture to culture, it's important to kind of keep that in mind or sort of review this if you're in this situation. And you also need to bring some sort of documentation to establish your relationship. So, a birth certificate, a marriage certificate, identity documents, things like that. Unaccompanied minors also qualify for an exception to the Safe Third Country Agreement, and there are a few other sort of things here. But anyways, that's just a little bit of an aside, probably not super important in your situation, but good to know about nonetheless. So I'll talk a bit about the different port of entry sort of processes that apply. So one of them is what's called the One Touch program. One Touch was launched by CBSA, Canadian Border Services Agency, at the end of 2022, and it's aimed at sort of streamlining the refugee process. It's supposed to be sort of gradually introduced everywhere in Canada, but that hasn't happened yet, and I'm not sure when it will or if it will. But it is being used in some places, like in Quebec, I know it's used pretty broadly. So under One Touch, basically, you have your eligibility. So remember, for inland claims, you had to go to this eligibility interview, which didn't happen until a few months after you submitted your claim. Under the One Touch program, basically, you make your claim at an airport or whatever. So maybe at Pierre Elliott Trudeau Airport in Montreal. And right away, your eligibility is determined so long as you meet basic criteria. So there's no concerns about your identity. You have some basic identity documents. You have contact information, et cetera. And so assumedly your eligibility is confirmed. If you are eligible, your eligibility is confirmed right there, and you receive your brand paper or refugee protection claimant document. You also get confirmation that your case has been referred to the Immigration and Refugee Board. And then there are a few things that you need to do, basically, and different sort of timelines apply for all of them. So you then have 45 days to complete your online portal, just like you would if you were doing an inland claim. We've already talked about that a bit. You also have 45 days to submit your basis of claim and narrative, and these need to be submitted directly to the IRB, the Immigration and Refugee Board. Again, I recommend talking to a lawyer, and they can help you to send those in, but it's pretty straightforward. And then the other thing you need to keep in mind is that you have 30 days again to do a medical exam, and you'll receive a form when you come in with instructions and guidelines on how to do that. When you fill the portal, again, you'll need to indicate that you need a work permit, and you'll have to wait to receive a work permit in the mail. And again, it can take some time. But in essence, that's how the One Touch program works. Another sort of potential way in which you might be processed if you come to a port of entry is where eligibility is determined at the port of entry, but it's not done via the One Touch program. So this is increasingly rare, but it still happens for certain claimants, including people who have crossed into Canada at Rainbow Bridge, which is at Niagara Falls. So generally, these people have their eligibility confirmed at the port of entry, and they receive their brand paper right away, the refugee protection claimant document. Which is like the refugee ID, as I mentioned. And they're also going to be required to complete various paper forms, which they do instead of having to complete the portal, and they do that at the port of entry. So the day that they arrive, they complete these forms, the generic Schedule A and the Schedule 12, and then the sort of upside of that is that they don't have to complete the portal. And then these people are given 30 days to complete their medical exam, and then 45 days to submit their basis of claim and their narrative directly to the Immigration and Refugee Board. And as in all the other situations, they're going to have to wait to receive a work permit. And then the final sort of way in which you might be processed if you're a port of entry claimant is where your eligibility is not determined at port of entry. So you make a refugee claim at the port of entry, but they don't determine your eligibility. So here what happens, Pearson Airport and other very busy ports of entry where, maybe they don't have time to do eligibility interviews for everybody. In these situations, you're going to receive an acknowledgement of claim document, just like the one that inland claimants receive after they submit their claim. And again, that can be used to access different benefits and to access the interim federal health care program. And then you'll also receive medical exam documents, and you need to complete, just this in any other situation, you have 30 days to complete that medical exam. They'll also conduct the biometric things, and they'll seize your passport and give you a certified copy. So that's all the stuff that's done when you make a claim in this circumstance. So for instance, at Pearson Airport. However, in this situation, there are a number of other things that still need to be done. So you need to fill out your portal. You'll get some instructions and a QR code, which will provide you with information on how to access the portal. It needs to be completed within 45 days. You'll get a piece of paper probably saying that. Although currently there's an automatic 30-day extension that they're granting. So if you don't complete it in 45 days, the practice right now is to just give you an extra 30 days. You don't have to do anything. But I would be careful about assuming that, because that could potentially change. So just flagging that. As I mentioned, you'll have 30 days to schedule and complete your medical exam. You're going to be also awaiting your work permit, which might take a few months to come. And you're also going to be waiting for an invitation to an eligibility interview, just as you would if you were an inland claimant, as we already discussed. So you'll probably wait a few months for that, and then you'll receive an email inviting you to come to an office to do what's called the eligibility interview. And this time, instead of IRCC conducting it, CBSA, Canadian Border Services Agency, will be the ones conducting it. But it basically works the same way. And assuming you're eligible, that is assuming you have no record of serious criminality, and assuming that you haven't made a previous refugee claim in one of the countries I mentioned earlier, your claim is going to be sent to the IRB, and you're going to get your brown paper. And then you will have 45 days to complete your basis of claim and your narrative and submit them to the IRB. Now, in general, if you need more time to submit your basis of claim to the IRB, you can ask them for an extension, or your lawyer can if you have one. It's possible to get an extension. They're usually pretty open to granting them. So if you do need more time, it's not the end of the world. You can ask them, but it's very important that you ask in advance. So don't do it, on day 45 right before it's due. And it's also very important that you provide some sort of explanation as to why you need the extension. So it can be something very simple, like I've just been having trouble, adjusting to life in Canada, or there's a language barrier, or I'm having a hard time accessing a reliable computer or internet connection or something like that. But you just need to provide some sort of explanation. Okay, so those are, in a nutshell, the various different ways in which you can initiate your refugee claim, and a sort of explanation of the different sorts of flows that follow from them, depending on how you make the claim. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the work permit. So the work permit is something that people are often really anxious about getting. I totally understand why. People want to be able to support themselves. They want to have a sense of agency and all that stuff. And I totally get that. Unfortunately, there are often delays in getting the work permit, as I mentioned. But as long as you fill out the portal properly and make sure you check that box, you should, as a refugee claimant, you're automatically eligible for a work permit. You don't have to pay a fee, and you should receive it automatically. Now, if your initial work permit, so sometimes this process can take a long time. And if your initial refugee claimant linked work permit expires during that time, which does sometimes happen, unfortunately, you can apply for another work permit, although you'll have to pay a fee this time. That's also the case if you lose your refugee claim, but you are eligible for pre-removal risk assessment, or in certain other circumstances, like your claim's expired, but you're appealing, or you have a judicial review application pending before a federal court. And there's certain other circumstances in which you also can potentially get a work permit, but generally it's important to know that, so even if your work permit says that it's valid from, I don't know, like June 2022 to June 2025, say, and say your refugee hearing is in June 2024, and you lose the hearing and you decide not to appeal for whatever reason. So if you've lost your refugee hearing, even though your work permit says it's going to be valid for another year after that, until June 2025, once you lose your refugee hearing and you decide not to appeal, it means you're no longer a refugee claimant, and so your work permit loses its validity. So it's just important to keep that in mind. As I mentioned earlier, it's fairly easy for refugee claimants to obtain their first work permit. You just have to click or check the right box when you're filling out the refugee portal, or if it's the paper forms, there's also a box you can check there. You don't have to pay a fee, and it's usually issued automatically. If you forget to check that box, or there's some sort of issue and you need to reapply for a work permit for whatever reason, it's a little bit more complicated. But it's something that you can come to an NGO or an organization like FCJ, and we're happy to help provide support. You'll probably have to pay a fee. I'm not sure exactly what the fee is nowadays, but it's not a ton of money. I think it's like $150 or something. And there might be a requirement that you provide more biometric information, but it's a relatively straightforward process as long as you continue to be eligible. If you lose eligibility, say you lose your claim and you don't appeal, then it's going to be very difficult to get a work permit. But yeah, just to know. And there's just to know it's important to apply to renew your work permit before it expires. So as I mentioned, sometimes a work permit expires over the course of waiting for a refugee hearing, for instance. It's very important to renew it before it expires. You don't want it to lapse. Um, and the same is true if you're a protected person. So if you're successful with your refugee claim and you're waiting for PR. So just make sure to do that, keep that in mind, and you should be able to work legally without any problem. Another thing, and I briefly touched on this earlier, is that it's very important to keep your address up to date, especially with IRCC in regards to the work permit. One way to do this is via the web form. We have a link here and some sort of basic instructions on how that works. It's fairly straightforward. You can also ask your lawyer or legal representative to help you if you need any help. But it is a fairly straightforward process. And basically, the reason that this is so important is because if you do move and you don't update your address and you haven't received your work permit, or you ever need to renew it, what's going to happen is IRCC is going to send the documents to your old address, and if they end up getting lost in the mail or something like that, it can really cause tons of administrative delays and really sort of create issues for you, obviously, because you want to keep all your documents up to date. So it's just a very simple thing that's just very important to remember to do. So if you do move, make sure you either update yourself using the web form or that you notify your lawyer or legal representative and have them update the address for you. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the refugee hearing. So the refugee hearing, it's a little bit like an interview, a little bit like a court case, like you might have seen on TV. And it's basically where they make a decision on whether or not, you qualify as a refugee, whether or not, everything in your the narrative and the basis of claim that you've submitted is true, and whether your case meets the criteria for refugee protection or for protection as a protected person. So after you submit your claim, and your narrative and your basis of claim have all been submitted, you're going to wait around. As I mentioned, the length of time you wait is really varies. I'd say it's usually at least 6 months. I'd say maybe 8 to 10 months is a little bit more typical, but some people wait much longer. Other people, it's a bit faster, and I have never totally understood why that's the case. It's not totally clear. But eventually, they'll schedule a hearing for you. The hearing is going to be scheduled. Usually you'll have a month or two of notice before the date of the hearing. And you'll receive something called a notice to appear or an NOA, and it will give you information on the date, the time, and the location. Most hearings now are virtual or remote, so there will also be a Microsoft Teams link that's going to be included there. So, on the day of the hearing, you just go, you click on that link, and it will take you to the virtual hearing room. A few things to keep in mind about the hearing. If you fail to show up for a hearing, then there's going to be what's called a special abandonment hearing. Usually it's conducted within 5 days, although that does vary. And you absolutely need to attend that hearing and provide a good explanation as to why you failed to attend the original hearing. So, can't just be something like, oh, I had something better to do, or you need to, have been sick, basically. Or have some other very serious life event happening. And they're often going to want proof. So, if you were sick for whatever reason, you should have a doctor's note you're able to present. Because if your claim is declared abandoned, that can obviously, basically it means that you lost your shot at making a refugee claim, and you really only get one. So it's definitely something to avoid. And then the other thing to mention is in advance of your hearing, if you need any special accommodations at your hearing, so due to any physical or mental health issues, let your lawyer or legal representative know, let them know well in advance, and they can try and basically apply to the board for accommodations for you. So that could be things like breaks. It could be for just asking the board member, who's kind of like the judge who's going to decide your case, to take a little bit more time with things, to ask to speak more slowly. There's all different kinds of accommodations, but if you do need that, it's very important to speak with your lawyer beforehand and have them contact the board and let them know well in advance. Another thing to keep in mind, sometimes you're going to want to join claims. So for instance, say you made a claim when you arrived in Canada in 2019, and then you have a family member who arrived in 2021, and they also made a claim, but the claims are basically sort of similar. They spring from the same events or something like that. In those situations, often a claim is going to be, you're going to want to have your claim joined. Um, Usually this is done automatically. But the board sort of figures it out themselves and they'll join the claim. But if they don't do that, you or your lawyer can just petition the board by submitting basically just a letter explaining that you want to have the claims joined, providing the names and the UCI numbers for each of the people whose claim is relevant, and it's very straightforward. Um, and it's important to know as well that children under the age of 12 who are accompanied by an adult, so, if you have kids basically who are making a refugee claim and they're under 12 years old, they're not going to be required to appear before the IRB's Refugee Protection Division unless the person who's making the decision, lets you know in advance that they're going to need to attend. So generally, if the kids are under 12, they will not need to attend. It's safe to assume, unless you hear otherwise. So, okay, how do you prepare for your hearing? So the hearing is obviously a big stressful thing, or it can be. It's a place where a very important decision is going to be made. So I think it's normal to feel a bit of stress, but I think you can do things to prepare to understand the process better so that you feel more in control on the day of the hearing. One thing that you should do early on is begin collecting evidence. So do this well in advance of the hearing, and that makes sure that you have everything you need by the day of the hearing. So what is evidence? Evidence is basically, there's two kinds of evidence. So there's personal evidence, which is anything that you can get a hold of that makes the events that you narrate in your narrative and basis of claim, so the story explaining why you need refugee protection, more likely to be true, right? So this could be text messages, photos, police reports, medical documents, sworn statements or affidavits from witnesses, letters from medical providers. So say you're seeing a therapist or something and you're dealing with some sort of trauma related to something that happened to you back in your country of origin, getting a letter from that therapist could be very useful. So that is one type of evidence, personal evidence. The second type of evidence is what we call country condition evidence. And this is sort of more general things about the situation in your country. So, say you're making a claim based on political persecution. This isn't about, what happened to you specifically, but it's more about, okay, in my country, it's well established that, opponents of the government regularly face arrest, detention, and torture. So anything that helps establish that as a general proposition, a general idea. So that can include things like newspaper articles, reports from non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, reports from governments or government agencies, things of that nature. I often use stuff from the US State Department, which is very useful, or from the Canadian Foreign Ministry as well. It's also very important to reflect on whether the evidence you're using supports the narrative. So what is the connection between the evidence and the things that you're alleging or stating in your narrative, right? Does the evidence you're submitting make it more likely that the events in your narrative actually happened? Or does the country condition evidence, conversely, fit with the story that you're describing in your narrative? So very important to keep that in mind. You also want to show that you're really afraid through the actions and the choices you've made. So, think about what you've done, how you behaved, and think about how that's going to be perceived by the board, right? So, if something happened to you in your country of origin, there was some incident where you were attacked or something, and then you waited, 8 months before you decided to leave the country. You can anticipate that the board member is going to ask you about that. They're going to say, if you were really scared, how come you waited so long before you left the country? And there's many explanations for that. You could say you didn't have enough money to travel, you couldn't get your documents together, you were afraid to leave your house, whatever. But just, try to anticipate that ahead of time because it's an issue that could come up. The same is true for, like, say there was a delay in making a claim after you arrived in Canada. So you arrived in Canada in 2021 and you didn't make your claim until 2023. You know, it's not the end of the world, but again, you're going to need some explanation as to why that was the case, why you waited that long, because otherwise they might say, oh, well, if you waited so long, maybe you weren't really afraid. So it's important to think about those things in advance to try and guess what kinds of questions the board is going to ask you. And again, if you have a lawyer, if you're paying somebody, or if you have legal aid, this is the kind of thing that you should talk to them about, and they should be able to help you. In terms of gathering evidence, it's important to know that all evidence needs to be translated. So anything that's not in English or French has to be translated into one of those languages and accompanied by a declaration like the one on the slide here, basically swearing that it's an accurate and faithful translation. Translation can take a while, so make sure that you begin this process well in advance if you need to have things translated. And just it's good to know legal aid usually covers the cost of translating evidence up to a certain amount. So I think it's usually currently it's 3,500 words at 20 cents a word. You can apply for more if you do have more evidence, but it won't necessarily be granted. But I think everyone automatically gets that right now. Another thing to remember in advance of the hearing. So it's really important before the hearing to just go over your narrative, you know, many, many times so that you're really familiar with it. You know what it says, you know what it doesn't say, etc. Sometimes when you're doing that, you notice that there's an issue with your narrative. Maybe there's a mistake. Maybe something was left out. Maybe something happened after you submitted it that's relevant to your story. So any of those things are fine. You can update the narrative, but it's important that you do it in the right way. Your lawyer should be able to help you with that again, but we do have instructions here on how to do it. You can make the changes to the original document, underline the new part, cross out the old part, sign each page and date it where there's a change, and then if it needs to be translated, have a interpreter translate it and include a declaration. But yeah, it's a relatively straightforward process. I would just caution against making really big changes to your narrative. So, you know, if you say in your original story that, you know, I was attacked by a guerrilla group and then you decide to change it to, you know, the government arrested me, I mean, that's going to create issues for sure. They're going to wonder about that contradiction. So this is more, you know, if there's a small mistake, a typo, somebody's name is wrong, or if there's new information that comes out, and something is after the narrative is submitted and you want to include that, that's where this sort of is going to be relevant. When you're preparing for your hearing, and I think also when you're writing your narrative, so this is also relevant in that context as well, there are a few different things that you need to kind of consider. So one is basically, so protection at home is one thing, right? So why can't your country keep you safe? Is going to be a fundamental question here. They're going to want to know whether you went to the police or to law enforcement. And if you did, how come they weren't able to protect you? And if you didn't, why did you choose not to? There's obviously many answers for that. It could be that police are corrupt. It could be that you know, didn't think they would help you for whatever reason. You know, there are many different explanations depending on your case, but it's important that you turn your mind to these things and think about them. You also need to think about what will happen if you return to your country. So is there a forward-facing risk? It's not always enough to just say something bad happened to me in the past. You need to convince them that there's going to be some danger to you if you are forced to return to your country. And you need to maybe also explain why the state or the police won't be able to protect you in the future. Another thing that is going to come up is the idea of internal relocation. In legal terminology, they use the term internal flight alternative, which basically just means why couldn't you move somewhere else within your country to escape? So, you know, say you're from Nigeria, say you get in trouble or you're in some sort of danger in Port Harcourt, how come you can't move to Abuja to escape? Or say you're from Mexico and you get in some trouble in Guadalajara, how come you can't move to Merida, which is supposed to be a really safe place? So it's important to think about those things. If you did move, you want to definitely explain that and explain why it was not an effective way of dealing with the problems or escaping the danger. And if you didn't move, you need to, think about why you didn't and why you wouldn't be safe if you did. The RPD is going to ask you questions like that. Those are the kinds of questions they're going to ask. The questions are sometimes hard. They're going to try to find weak points in your narrative and sort of pick at those. So it's important that you, and often your lawyer, if you're working with your lawyer, sort of turn your mind to these things, think about them, and be prepared to answer these kinds of questions. If there's critical evidence missing, and this is another important thing. So say, you're saying in your narrative that you received threatening messages at some point, but then you don't have those threatening messages because you deleted them or whatever. The RPD is going to want to know, or the RPD, again, being the Refugee Protection Division of the Immigration and Refugee Board, this is the board that hears the refugee claim. They're going to want to know why you don't have these messages. Why you don't have this basic evidence. So you need to be able to explain that, right? If you're missing any critical evidence, anything that it seems you should have, you need to have some explanation for that. It's also important in regards to evidence that you keep any information, any sort of packaging that was sent to you holding evidence. So if somebody sent you, some papers from your country of origin, make sure you keep the envelopes and packaging. It's quite common that the board will want to see that to confirm that it's authentic. As I mentioned, make sure you review the narrative. Do this a lot so that you're really familiar with it. Make appointments with your lawyer. And again, your lawyer can help you by going through your narrative, telling you what to expect, and also by some lawyers will hold basically what's called a mock hearing, where they sort of pretend to be a board member and they sort of ask you the kinds of questions that they think are going to come up in the hearing as a way of preparing you. And that's a really useful way of preparing, I've found. And finally, keep the IRB informed about changes in your address. And the IRB is, you contact the IRB about address in a different way than you contact IRCC. So I know it can be a bit confusing. Again, speak to your lawyer if you have one. They should be able to help you with this. I'll talk about it a little bit more in a moment, but it's very important that you keep your address up to date, both with IRCC, which you do via a web form, as I already mentioned, and with IRB, which you can do via fax or email. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But if you don't keep your address up to date, you might miss important communication, which can be a real issue. So the day of the refugee hearing. Most hearings are half a day, which in practice is around 3 hours, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less. You might be told in advance that you have a shorter hearing. Usually that's good news. It means that there's less sort of, they see that there are less issues with your claim, and it's maybe a little bit more likely that it's going to be successful, but you don't know for sure. The decision that is going to be made solely on the evidence presented, as well as any testimony that you give, and as well as the documents you submitted in your refugee claim, i.e. your basis of claim and your narrative. You're going to attend the hearing virtually. Usually that's what happens these days. There might be some circumstances in which they do in-person hearings, but generally it's virtually. Your lawyer will be there. The board member is going to be there, who again is like the judge. That's the person who's going to be deciding your case. If you're calling any witnesses, they'll be there. And then if the minister's counsel is intervening, I'm not going to get into that in too much detail, but sometimes if your claim has serious issues, or if they think that there are serious issues with credibility, i.e. that they think you're lying, sometimes the minister's counsel will intervene and basically try to argue that you shouldn't be given refugee protection. If that happens, you'll know well in advance. But if they are intervening, there's also going to be a lawyer from the minister's office there as well. If your hearing is virtual, as most hearings are nowadays, make sure that you have a quiet, private space, somewhere where you can be alone, where people aren't going to interrupt you, and make sure you have a good, reliable internet connection. If you don't have access to any of those things, talk to your lawyer. Many lawyers and law firms have spaces in their offices where clients can go to conduct hearings. And if they don't, you can come to an organization like FCJ, and we can see if we can try to help you with something like that. I think that nowadays the RPD or the IRB recently moved offices in Toronto. So the new Toronto office now has special hearing rooms where you can go and sit and do a hearing there. So that's also an option. And again, your lawyer should be able to help organize that for you. At the beginning of the hearing, board members are going to state how they're going to make any special accommodations, especially if there are any sort of issues around certain guidelines that they have to adhere to. I'm not going to get into that in too much detail. And again, during the hearing, it's okay to request breaks. So if you need some time to gather your thoughts, to get a glass of water, something like that, you can request a break. And as I mentioned before, children under 12 are not required to testify most of the time, although there are certain exceptions, but you'll know about that in advance. Okay, I'm not going to go into this. This is sort of a repeat slide, but basically this is just a sort of outline of the kinds of questions that they're going to be asking you on the day of the hearing. In terms of answering questions, I think that there's a couple of different things to keep in mind. So if you don't know the answer to a question, don't answer, if you don't know the answer to a question, just say, I don't know. That's totally fine. Don't make something up. Don't say what you think they want to hear. If you don't know the answer, just say, I don't know. It's perfectly acceptable to do that. If you don't understand a question, say you didn't hear it or you just don't understand how it's being phrased, it's totally fine to ask them to repeat it and to clarify it until you do understand. That's fine. Don't be afraid to do that. I know it can be sort of daunting sometimes to be in that situation, but it's important that you understand a clear and accurate response. It's very common for the board member to ask you sort of similar questions, but with slightly different wording. They do this sometimes, maybe they just want to clarify something, or maybe they're trying to trip you up or to make sure that you don't have any contradictions in your answer. So if you feel like they're just asking you the same question over again, just answer it the same way. That's totally fine. When a question is asking for specific information, just provide that information. So, questions when, where, who, things like that. When did something happen? Just say, June 19th, 2017. Don't get into extra details and things like that. It's better to just answer the question and leave it at that. If the question's a bit more open-ended, if they say, explain something, tell me about something, describe something, etc., that's a sort of indication that they want a longer, more open-ended answer. So then you can kind of talk a little bit more. But if they're just asking for specific information, just give that information. At the end of the refugee hearing, generally what happens is the board member will, so there's sort of two possible situations. So the board member might make a decision right away. They'll usually take a few minutes and then they will make a decision right there and then. Usually if that happens, the decision's positive, although it can be negative as well. But usually in that situation, it's positive, so that's a good sign. Or they might say they need some more time to arrive at a decision and they won't issue one right away, and you might not receive one for a few weeks or even months. But then they'll send a decision with written reasons, and in that case, it might be positive, it might be negative. If there's any delay, if you've been waiting months and you haven't received anything, you or your lawyer can contact the board and usually they'll get back to you relatively quickly. And yeah, that's essentially how the decision-making process works. Now, if the claim is accepted, and I hope that all of you have this experience, that your hearings go well and your claims are accepted, will be granted what's called protected person status in Canada. And protected persons can begin the process of applying for permanent residence, and eventually they can think about beginning the process of family reunification via sponsorship. And permanent residents, when they're eligible, when they meet the various eligibility criteria, can apply for Canadian citizenship. In regards to all of this stuff, it's just important to be realistic about timelines. So all of this can take quite a while. I know people are really eager to have their lives stabilized, to reunite with family members, all of that. But it's important to be realistic about this and to understand that it usually we're talking about, a matter of years, right? Not months or weeks. And so it's just important to know that, to manage your expectations. If the decision is negative, so if you receive a negative decision from the RPD, It is not the end of the world. Obviously, it's not the outcome that anybody wants, but it's not the end of the world, and it's important to keep that in mind. So most negative decisions have the right to apply for or to appeal basically to the Refugee Appeal Division, the RAD, which is another branch of the Immigration and Refugee Board. There are a few situations in which you won't be allowed to appeal, where a claim is withdrawn or abandoned. We talked a lot about abandonment a little bit earlier. You cannot appeal to the RAD, and where a decision says that a claim has no credible basis or is manifestly unfounded, which basically means they think that you're lying, you also can't apply to the RAD. And that's also true for claims made at land borders as exceptions to the Safe Third Country Agreement. So those claims have to go directly to what's called judicial review. I'll talk about that in a second. But for everyone else, you have the right to appeal to the Refugee Appeal Division. At the Refugee Appeal Division, basically, you can argue that the RPD made the wrong decision, that their decision was unreasonable, that it was unjust for some reason. You might be able to submit new evidence. That's generally only true if there's evidence that you were unable to provide for the RPD for some compelling reason, either because you couldn't get a hold of it for some reason, or because it didn't exist then, because it was something that happened after the hearing. So sometimes you can provide new evidence. But generally, it's a little bit trickier to do that. And in general, RAD appeals are paper appeals, so there's no oral hearing like there is for the RPD. It's just all written. And again, in this situation, I would highly recommend speaking with a lawyer or legal representative for help in preparing appeal, because they can be very technical, even more so to offer certificates. But you sometimes need to get assessed for merit to do whether or not there's a chance that you can succeed. So, and the other thing to know is that there's kind of a tight timeline for submitting appeals. So you have 15 days from the day you receive the negative decision to file what's called a notice of appeal, and then you have an additional 30 days to file the actual sort of arguments that you're going to make. So important to know that time is of the essence in this situation. If there is no appeal to the Refugee Appeal Division, or if you're well, okay, or if you lose your appeal, I guess, you are subject to removal. And basically, you're asked to leave Canada within 30 days voluntarily. Or if you don't, you become subject to a forcible removal order, and things get a little bit more complicated, and that can also make it a little bit more difficult to return to Canada in the future. So that's all important to remember. However, if your RAD is unsuccessful, or if you don't have the right to appeal to the RAD, you'll always have the option of applying for what's called judicial review to federal court. And this is basically just an application to federal court to look at the decision that the RPD made to determine whether or not it was reasonable. If you want to do this, I highly recommend you get legal advice. It's, again, complicated and technical. You might be able to get a legal aid certificate for it. It really depends on your circumstances, but I highly recommend you try to talk to a lawyer. If you need help with that, you can come to an organization like FCJ, and we're happy to provide you with some guidance. I think, and sometimes when you apply for a judicial review, your deportation or removal is automatically stayed. So that means you can't be removed. In other situations, that's not the case. It's going to vary a lot case by case. So again, very important to talk to a lawyer in this situation. Another option that you might have is what's called a pre-removal risk assessment. Or a PRA. I talked about this a little bit earlier. You might be able to get a PRA, as I mentioned, if you're found ineligible to make a refugee claim. Other circumstances in which you get a PRA is if you're subject to removal. So basically you have an enforced removal order and you can be deported or removed from the country, and where a 12-month period has passed after you made your last refugee claim, or after the last decision of the IRB was made in your case. So either the last RPD decision or the last RAD appeal decision. So in that circumstance, you have basically, if you meet both these criteria, you're eligible to do a PRA, pre-removal risk assessment. And the PRA is basically, it's a little bit like a mini refugee claim. You kind of just have to show that you're going to be in danger if you return to your country of origin. There's a pretty tight timeline for doing it. You'll get invited to do one. So they'll call you into the CBSA office. They'll give you some forms. You'll have 15 days to fill in and submit those forms, and then another 15 days to add any additional evidence. And you can only submit new evidence. So you can't use the same evidence that you used for your refugee claim. You have to submit new evidence showing that there is, some risk of danger that they weren't considering when they made your original refugee decision. If you receive a removal order. So basically, the removal process is a bit different in every case. Sometimes it takes weeks. Sometimes, usually, I'd say weeks is a bit fast. Usually it's more months and sometimes years. You'll know that CBSA is taking steps to remove you when you receive a letter from them calling you in for an interview. You might get something called a call-in notice. So once you receive something like that, I highly recommend that you either come to an organization like ours and talk to us, or that you go and speak with your lawyer and show them the document you received. It's important to remember that removal is a process. So it's extremely unlikely that you're going to be immediately removed from the country during your first interview with CBSA. Usually they're going to start, they're going to call you in, they're going to talk to you, they might ask you some questions, and then based on that, they might call you in for a further appointment, a further interview, and but it's a process. You're not just going to show up to that first interview and they're just immediately going to put you on a plane. So just important to keep that in mind. When you do meet with CBSA, it's important also to make clear that you're willing to follow the rules and that you're going to obey the law. If they think that you're not, if they think that there's a risk that you're going to try to go underground or to disappear so that you don't get removed, it's possible they'll try to detain you, and you obviously want to avoid that situation. Detention is not fun, I can guarantee you. So that's important to keep in mind. And if you are facing removal, again, speak to a lawyer or come to an organization like ours, and we can provide some guidance on what options might be open to you. You might be able to apply to defer the removal, or there might be other options as well. Another thing that you can do in a circumstance where your refugee claim has failed is to apply for what's called a permanent residence based on humanitarian and compassionate grounds, or a H&C application. Basically, an H&C application is an application for permanent residence, basically for people who wouldn't normally qualify for permanent residence, but where sufficient humanitarian and compassionate grounds exist to justify granting permanent residence. And usually what they'll look at is whether you have an established life in Canada. So like, how long have you been here? Do you have a lot of friends? Do you have a community? Are you working? Are you supporting yourself? Things like that. That's one thing they'll look at. Another is what's called the best interest of the children. So, do you have children in Canada? How will they be negatively affected by removal? Do you have children back home who are relying on money that you're sending home to them, and how will your removal impact them? That's another thing. And then finally is hardship. So any sort of, challenges that you're going to face if you return to your country of origin, and especially what's called medical hardship. So if you have any medical conditions that you might not be able to get treatment for in your country of origin, that's something else that they might consider. Again, if you want to apply for an H&C, again, I recommend you speak with a lawyer. It is possible to get a legal aid certificate to cover the cost of an H&C. If you need help getting one, come to an organization like FCJ, and we can try to assist you with that. And our website has various guides in different languages on how to begin putting together an H&C application. So important to keep in mind. Oh yeah, and there's a few people who need to remember that they won't be eligible to apply for an H&C. So if you have a pending refugee claim, so you're currently in the process of making your claim, you're waiting for your hearing or waiting for your decision, you're not able to apply for an H&C application. There's also a 12-month bar after the last decision on your refugee application. So if you appeal the RPD decision and the appeal is denied, you have to wait 12 months from the day of the appeal before you can submit your H&C application. If your refugee claim is abandoned, you're going to have to wait 12 months after the date of abandonment before you can submit an H&C. However, it's important to know that there are exceptions to the 12-month bar where there's medical hardship. So where you have some medical issue that can't be treated in your country of origin, they might waive the 12-month bar, and also where there's best interest of the children consideration. So if you have minor children who are going to be impacted by your removal, they will also waive the 12-month bar. So just important to keep in mind. Um, so yeah, that in a nutshell is an overview of the entire refugee claim process and the different options that are open to you. If a claim is not successful as well, I'm going to now just go through a few slides with different resources for refugee claimants. As I mentioned, we'll have these slideshows online, and I think we're also going to try to share a PDF version of this so you can look at the stuff later. But I'll just sort of briefly go over everything just so you have a sense of what's out there. Um, so there are a lot of great resources for refugee claimants. One are these virtual ready tours that are offered by the Immigration and Refugee Board. So these are these like online tours where you can kind of, they go over the hearing process, they give you a sense of what a hearing is going to be like, and sort of help you to prepare. The Refugee Appeal Division also offers a similar thing. And I think that these are very useful, definitely worth checking out. You can find information about them, I believe, on our website. Um, we also have some information on different refugee resources available, information on social assistance. As I mentioned, most refugee claimants are going to be eligible for Ontario Works if they're in Ontario. They can apply for language classes, and we have information on that. There are various employment services open to them, and they can also apply at a Service Canada office, as I mentioned, for a SIN number, which is a requirement if they want to work in Canada. FCJ also offers a variety of different webinars on like this one, but on more specific topics. So we have all different ones coming up. You can check our website and see a list of the latest webinars as well as recordings of some of our past ones. Important to keep in mind. And there are, as I mentioned, a great way to prepare for refugee hearings is to do these simulated or mock hearings where you have somebody pretending to be a board member, one of the sort of refugee judges, as I mentioned, asking you all the questions, going over your narrative, going over your evidence. I think that's the best way to prepare for a hearing. And there were a few places that offer to do these simulated refugee hearings free of charge. There's some resources here for different organizations that can do that for you. You should also, if you have a lawyer, talk to your lawyer about doing that, and hopefully they can arrange something similar as well. And then we have a list here of different settlement services. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but again, we'll share this around, and these are different organizations that can support you with all kinds of things from housing to employment to language, etc. Okay, so that's it. That's the end of the presentation. I hope that it was useful. I know it was a lot of information, but as I mentioned, we'll make sure that there's access to this slideshow and that people can review it down the line to sort of go over anything that they might want to go back to or that they might have missed. You're also welcome to come to, if you're in the GTA or if you want to make the journey to the GTA, you're welcome to come to our offices, which are located at 208 Oakwood Avenue in Toronto. Our intake day, the day when we sort of see new clients, is Mondays generally. Feel free to come by if you have any questions or issues or there's something that you need specific help with. And yeah, I hope that this was really useful.